have just been playing around with my camera for about 2.5 hours, so if I look like I crawled out of a sewer, that's probably why.
You're so ugly, Hello Kitty, say goodbye.
Hey there guys, my name's Megan if you're new here, and if not, welcome back to Killer Weekend, where each week we'll discuss a new true crime case and you guys can feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments box below. If you like all things true crime news, then please hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming episodes. Remember, you can now listen in over on Spotify too, so please support the channel with a big juicy 5-star review. I will leave a small disclaimer at the beginning of this episode. It does involve details of violent crime, sexual assault and sexual assault against a minor. If that's a trigger point for you, then please feel free to turn away now. And remember, if you've nothing nice to say...
Shut up! Shut up!
Hi gremlins! If you know me, and to be honest, most of you might not, unless you know you're my mum who sits and watches this every week. Hi mum! You might not know that I am a fan of everything to do with horror. I love horror movies, and specifically, I am obsessed with horror video games. Now, am I any good at playing these games? Absolutely not. If we were going to actually judge my skill set, I think I would say I'm a level above god awful, but I enjoy playing them, and that's what matters. Anywho, as I was saying, I love them, and only a couple of years ago, I discovered the mythical crossover of a horror movie about a horror video game. It's called Stay Alive. Now, the cast for this feature film is actually quite impressive. You've got Sophia Bush from One Tree Hill, just an all-round babe. And then you also have Samir Armstrong, who's the annoying girl in the OC. She wasn't annoying, her character was annoying, just to clarify. And then you have Frankie Muniz from basically everything in the early 2000s. And finally, fun fact, remember the crazy fruit guy from Friends, Adam Goldberg? Well, he's in there too. Essentially, the premise of this movie is a group of gamer friends stumble across a new high-tech video game based on the crimes of 16th century aristocrat Elizabeth Bathory. As luck would have it, however, the game is cursed. Oh no, of course. So Crazy Fruit Guy and his pals start dropping like flies. Does the plot make any sense? Not at all. But it is a fun one to add to your collection, and it also has some historical themes, which is actually quite interesting to me. As someone who got married in a rundown castle where Mary Queen of Scots once lived, it should come as no surprise that I'm a fan of a little bit of history trivia. So, when I dug deep into this movie's origin story and learned all about Elizabeth Bathory and her questionable skin routine, I knew I had to cover this one. You see, in the movie, Elizabeth's kills were pretty gnarly. However, in real life, her violent outbursts knew no bounds, and she was clearly capable of a lot more than what a PG-13 rating would allow. There's always been many rumours surrounding Elizabeth and how she chose to torture her various victims, but tonight everyone, we'll reveal the truth behind the legend, and maybe we might be able to answer the question of, are vampires real? And if so, was Elizabeth Bathory one of them? According to ancient Egyptian folklore, the goddess Sekhmet is the oldest vampire lore known to man. Forced to punish humans for their sins, Sekhmet would drink her victims' blood, ingesting their life force to replenish her powers. It's said that her father, the sun god Ra, would colour beer red with dye in order to satisfy her thirst for blood. Even though her MO fits the description of what we now know as vampires, that word actually didn't exist back then. Instead, she was referred to as the Lady of Slaughter and the one before whom evil trembles. Spooky. Now, if you're like me, then you will be someone who needs a little bit more proof in their pudding. I'm talking about hard physical evidence and proof of vampires. In June 2012, researchers unearthed a supposed vampiric corpse from the 1300s whilst excavating an old monastery in Sozopol, Bulgaria. The remains were that of an adult male approximately in his 30s, and not only had he had an iron stake driven through his chest, but several of his teeth had been forcibly removed, a popular anti-bloodsucker ritual from back in the day. In recent years, Bulgaria has served as a treasure trove of strange carcasses, and archaeologist Nikolai Ovcharov, who is known as the Bulgarian Indiana Jones, is the man brave enough to dig up these alleged children of the night. Images from the dig sites show human remains tied to the ground and secured with iron clamps. Once trapped safely underground, burning embers would have been scattered across the top of the grave site to stop the occupant from rising again. Now, you would assume that after all of his spooky discoveries, Nikolai would be a firm believer in the supernatural. But it's actually quite the opposite. He's mentioned publicly that whilst he finds these burial practices fascinating, he doesn't believe in the existence of vampires. He mainly chalks it up to mass hysteria around Bulgaria in the 1300s, something that was only exacerbated by the heinous actions of the infamous Vlad the Impaler in the 1400s. As most of you history, horror and literature buffs will know, Vlad, a nobleman from Transylvania, was the inspiration behind one of the biggest horror phenomena of our time, Bram Stoker's Dracula. His cruel forms of capital punishment were deemed as unholy and unnecessarily brutal, and you know, if they were saying that in the 15th century, then it must have been bad. In this illustration by Ambrosius Huber, we get a tiny taste of the violence that Vlad would inflict on his enemies, and it's easy to see how he became the muse for a fictional bloodthirsty killer. In the years that have followed, Vlad has been portrayed as many different characters, and somewhere along the way he was branded a vampire, and for some reason, that is the only one that stuck. Much like Elizabeth Bathory, the public interest surrounding Vlad only intensified after he was gone, and now, 6 centuries later, people are still talking about him. This just goes to show how obsessed the general public are when it comes to the topic of vampirism and life after death. And to be perfectly honest, if it hadn't been for those living in the 20th century, Vlad and Elizabeth probably wouldn't have been deemed vampires. There are no accounts based in fact, just exaggerated whispers that have been created hundreds of years later in an odd bid to make these terrible stories even more terrible. It would appear as though being a cold-blooded serial killer just isn't scary enough, and that indeed people need more to satisfy their horror needs. Over the last 2 decades, we've definitely witnessed a shift in the film and television industry. It used to be enough for a middle-aged man to shove on a granny wig and unflattering dress to chase innocent women around his motel, but no. People these days want more. More gore, more kills, and definitely more supernatural influence. Take the original Halloween movies as an example. When we compare Halloween to a movie like Scream that was directed by Wes Craven just 18 years later, the differences are wild. Much like Halloween, Scream centres around one mass protagonist, Ghostface. However, now we're forced to watch on-screen favourites like Drew Barrymore and Henry Winkler, also known as the Fonz, being butchered beyond recognition. These gruesome kills stood in stark contrast to what we'd been used to with no-gore films like Halloween, and it's safe to say that on the Scream set, the pig's blood was definitely flowing. Growing up, I remember finding the Rose McGowan garage door scene particularly traumatising, and I'm sure that for decades to come, it will stand as one of the most creative death scenes in horror cinema. Since Scream first hit cinemas almost 30 years ago, directors have continued to up the ante, and today I think you'd be hard pressed to find a horror film that didn't include one of two things: otherworldly forces and lots of blood and guts and gore. Now you might be wondering what all this talk has to do with Elizabeth Bathory and her nefarious crimes. But her story and the way it's evolved over the past 450 years is a prime example of the human fascination with horror and our insatiable need to exaggerate all things dark and deadly, even if that means adding a little bit of fiction into the mix for dramatic effect. Elizabeth Bathory was born on the 7th of August 1560 in the town of near Batter, Hungary, to her parents Anna and George Bathory VI. Raised alongside her brother Stefan and two sisters, Elizabeth never wanted for anything. As a child, she was gifted with fine jewels and stunning gowns. Unlike a lot of children from that time period, the Bathorys were also afforded the luxury of a good education. Elizabeth spoke many languages, including Latin, Greek, German and Hungarian, and was literally raised in a castle. However, it wasn't all rosy, of course, and there was a downside to being brought up in the 1500s, when women had little to no rights, even those living in extreme wealth. Her whole life, little Elizabeth was taught to be one thing, and one thing only, and that was appealing to men. Everything centred around her being able to secure an impressive match when she became of age, and for reference, of age in the 16th century usually meant around 13 years old. Like most young girls born into nobility, Elizabeth was quickly realising that her life, although privileged, came with a lot of rules. Rules that as a female she would have to obey. Considered a natural beauty throughout her hometown, a 10-year-old Elizabeth was then promised to a nobleman named Ferenc Nadasdy, and the marriage was set to benefit both families politically and financially. As was customary, she was sent to live on the Nadasdy's estate, but Ferenc, whose parents had just died, was now an orphan, so Elizabeth's well-being was left in the hands of those who worked there. It's reported that 3 years into the engagement, Elizabeth fell pregnant. She later stated in 1609 at the age of 50 that the father of the child, Ladislav Bendy, had drugged her and then sexually assaulted her. She was 13. Bendy was a servant on the family's property on the river Danube, and when Ferenc found out about the alleged attack, he was outraged, even having Bendy castrated and ripped apart by wild dogs. A few months later, Elizabeth did give birth to a baby girl who she named Anastasia Bathory. Anastasia was sent away to Transylvania to live with another family. Because she was of noble blood, hush money was divided between those who knew about the baby in order to protect Elizabeth's reputation. The wedding of Ferenc and Elizabeth went ahead as planned on the 8th of May 1575. It was said to be a lavish affair with over 4,000 guests in attendance. The Nadasdy family gifted the young couple with Kishti's castle, where Elizabeth hoped they could start anew. However, the horrors of her past would not be so easily forgotten. According to several sources, Ferenc was a cruel master and would often punish his servants with physical torture. On one occasion, he ordered a young maid to strip, lather herself in honey, and then stand outside where she was swarmed by insects. Allegedly, he relished in their suffering and even invited his new bride to join in the fun. Some do say that this was in retaliation for all of those times where Elizabeth was mistreated by staff, and to discipline those who stood and watched on as Ladislav violated her. I'm not really sure if I buy that whole us against the world theory, however, because for all intents and purposes, their marriage was a marriage of convenience, and whilst Ferenc was away, Elizabeth would definitely play. She supposedly had many lovers, and some even questioned the paternity of the 3 children she would later have with Ferenc. Although I can't condone the horrific acts she would soon commit, I have to say for a certain period in time, Elizabeth was a force to be reckoned with. In 1578, Ferenc was promoted to chief commander of the Hungarian forces, and in his absence, she really thrived. Her love of education gave her the skill set to manage the land, and she was even successful in warding off potential invaders. In one letter she stated, "So my good sir, you have done this thing. You have occupied my small possessions because you are poor, but I do not think that we will leave you to enjoy them in peace. You will find in me a man." Elizabeth made it very clear that she would not be taken advantage of again, and she made a lot of people uncomfortable with her dominant personality. After she married Ferenc, she insisted on keeping her own surname because, in her own words, she was from the wealthier and older bloodline. Of course, the men in her circle, they didn't like this at all, misogyny and that. So they referred to her, much to her dismay, as Lady Nadazde. Men be menning. Anywho, there is a stark difference between the Elizabeth Bathory we read about in history books compared to the one that we've seen portrayed on screen. According to reports from the time, she was an advocate for women in need and often supplied aid to young girls who'd been left pregnant as a result of rape. So, it does beg the question, how did this independent powerhouse of a woman turn into the violent savage that we know of today? Well, whilst Elizabeth did enjoy some of the finer things in life, she was also a witness to some traumatic scenes as a child. Torture was commonplace back in the 16th century, and at a young age, Elizabeth would be exposed to some of the worst atrocities someone can inflict on another human being. On one particular occasion, she played in the corner as a man who was accused of selling his own child to a Turkish soldier was stitched into the stomach of a horse. Elizabeth, who was a toddler at the time, laughed her little head off as the man desperately pressed against the carcass of the horse until he eventually suffocated inside. Her family were notorious for their controversial treatment of those who worked for them, and this was something that both she and Ferenc shared. He was well known for his brutality both on and off the battlefield. He allegedly enjoyed decapitating his victims and then playing football with their severed heads. It was also said that he would sometimes dance with their corpses and put on a little show. So just an all-round scary guy. Health-wise, Elizabeth didn't have it so easy. In her youth, she suffered from epileptic fits and frequent blackouts. Now, this could have been a sign of a deeper neurological issue, and knowing what we know now, it probably was. Bear in mind, this was about 400 years before lobotomies and electroshock therapy were introduced. So yeah, the best you could hope for was to be locked away in a wee room somewhere. Now, if you're not familiar with Countess Bathory and her reign of terror, then it may shock you to know that her approximate body count was said to have been at around 650 girls. That does seem excessive, and you're probably wondering, how did all of these women vanish without anyone kicking up a fuss? And the answer is simple: they were poor. Back in the days of petticoats and bedpans, it wasn't actually illegal to torture your servants, and even though they received multiple complaints for the way in which they treated their staff, Elizabeth and Ferenc were never punished for it. Sadly, or not so sadly, I guess, Ferenc's days were numbered, and on January 4th, 1604, he passed away from a mystery illness. The fierce soldier once known as the Black Knight of Death was gone, and his premature death left Elizabeth vulnerable. As she and her children mourned the loss of Ferenc, the vultures had already started circling overhead, and a plan to get rid of the Countess and steal her land was afoot. According to historians, this is when Elizabeth really kicked it up a notch regarding her unhinged behaviour. Apparently, torture and execution wasn't exactly scratching the old psychotic proverbial itch anymore. She would allegedly burn her victims with candle wax, and as they lay dying, bite into their flesh, leaving deep wounds behind. Foolishly, Elizabeth expected that her position in high society would protect her from the swift hand of justice, as it had for the past 20 years. But unfortunately, without the brutish Ferenc by her side, she wasn't exactly the intimidating public figure that she once had been. Outsiders didn't exactly love the idea of a lowly female taking control over all that land and responsibility, so it would only be a matter of time before people began to dig for reasons as to why Elizabeth should be stripped of her title. Even her own relatives had something to say about how she ran the estate, and pretty soon that envy would manifest into a deadly conspiracy between Elizabeth's own cousin and the King of Hungary himself. Whilst he was alive and kicking, Ferenc did a lot of wheeling and dealing, often offering sizable amounts of cash to those in need, with a sizable interest rate, of course. One of those people he'd helped out of a jam was Matthias II, King of Hungary. Now, Matthias had hoped that when the Count died, so would his responsibility of paying off those debts. Clearly, he'd never met a woman like Elizabeth Bathory before. Whilst her husband bravely fought on the battlefield, she'd stepped in to manage their affairs, and when he passed, she continued to do so. Like most misogynists, Matthias didn't like being held accountable by a woman, and so he concocted a plan to get rid of her and his debts. Luckily for those who were conspiring against her, Elizabeth's rap sheet wasn't exactly squeaky clean, and upon further inspection, the king discovered quite a few dirty skeletons in her family closet. The many complaints made against both Ferenc and Elizabeth in the past allowed the crown to investigate the ghoulish goings-on at Castle Castise. Elizabeth's cousin Jörg Thurzo took statements from 80 witnesses who all claimed that within the walls of her home, she was orchestrating her own twisted version of the Hunger Games. Young girls would arrive at the castle, but they wouldn't ever leave. Well, unless they were willing to get their hands dirty. Several servants would partake in the torture of these young women, all to stay out of Elizabeth's firing line. She had a hairline trigger, and it was better to deal with the overwhelming guilt than to suffer her wrath. According to those working under the Countess at the time, it didn't really take much to piss Elizabeth off. A spilled glass of water here, a rogue speck of dust there. She was merciless. We will probably never truly know what drove Elizabeth to murder, but what we do know of her childhood and life experiences, we can make an educated guess. I don't think it was a coincidence that all of her victims ended up being young females, and I do think there's a reason as to why she targeted solely servants within her castle. As a girl, Elizabeth was raised to believe that her perceived attractive appearance and femininity was her only currency in life, and without it, she wasn't worth much. As we mentioned before, women born into nobility in the 1500s were essentially taught to be perfect little dolls. Looking gorgeous in a ball gown was about 90% of their job description. Elizabeth was said to have been quite vain and very focused on her looks. So of course, after the birth of her children, when her skin began to age and she no longer felt desirable, that definitely must have messed with her sense of self and purpose. Those knocks at the chamber door became less frequent, and it's possible that she saw these teenage ladies' maids as the one thing she would never be: young. If we journey back to that horrific sex attack that Elizabeth endured as a child, we could also see why she has such an intense hatred for her servants. After all, they were the ones who sat back while she was bullied, eventually kidnapped, and finally left with an unwanted pregnancy. Did her victims symbolise all of those castle employees who stood by in silence as her young life was ruined? Whatever her motives, what she did was wrong, and on the 29th of December 1610, Elizabeth Bathory and her 4 accomplices were indicted for murder. But there was one teeny tiny problem. As you may remember, it wasn't illegal for a woman of her social standing to beat their servants to death, and therefore the king had to get slightly creative with the truth. After arresting his own flesh and blood, cousin Jörg claimed he'd received further damning witness statements that conveniently proved Elizabeth wasn't just slaying paupers. Oh no. According to his findings, Big Liz also hosted a finishing school for young ladies, and while at first her offer of educating these girls in all things countess seemed kind and generous, it would appear as though her motives were slightly more sinister. Thurzo's version of events were that these wealthy children went into Castle Cashtice to learn and left in a body bag. Could they prosecute Elizabeth for killing the poor? No. But could they punish her for killing the rich? Oh yes. Funnily enough, these new revelations allowed the king and Thurzo to throw the book at Elizabeth Bathory, all while striking up a mutually beneficial deal. In the wake of her imprisonment, Elizabeth's family so generously waived all of King Matthias's debts, and in return, they received all of her and Ferencis' lands and holdings. She was dragged off to a walled-up room within her own home and fed through a small slit in the stones for the rest of her days. Jörg Thurzo ruled against a trial, fearing it would be bad for optics, and so, without any concrete evidence at all of her guilt, Elizabeth Bathory was condemned a murderer. Once one of the most powerful women in Europe, she was forced to live in her cold jail cell until she was found dead at the age of 54 on the 21st of August 1614. In death, much like in life, Elizabeth refuses to fade into the pages of the musty textbooks of the 1500s. And still to this day, she is a notable figure both in history and in pop culture. Since her conviction, which, by the way, would never fly in today's court system, the tales surrounding the murderous countess and her many crimes have mutated into something that I'm sure not even her twisted imagination could have cooked up. Over the past 400-ish years, Elizabeth Bathory has gone from maid killer to finishing school slayer to female Count Dracula, all without a single scrap of physical proof. Many of the so-called confessions that were collected by Thurzo back in 1609 were done so under extreme duress. As it would turn out, those being questioned by Thurzo would have told him anything if it meant the agonising pain would stop. Years before her imprisonment, a Lutheran minister named Istvan Magere wrote about Elizabeth and her barbaric treatment of her female servants. Because of this, we can likely assume that she wasn't a good person, and even though she never killed anyone of nobility, Elizabeth certainly deserved to die in that cell. But I've probably got you all wondering now, where did those vampire rumours come from, and why have they stuck around like a bad smell to this day? Well, back in 1729, Laszlo Tarossi, a scholar and a member of the Society of Jesus, wrote that not only did Elizabeth murder hundreds of young women, but that she also bathed in their blood to maintain a soft and youthful glow. This rumour that Elizabeth required the blood of virgins to sustain her beauty is both untrue and just another jab at her rumoured vain disposition. The fact that it's totally false should have stopped future writers from running with it though, yeah? No. Absolutely not. Despite the fact that there are no factual links between vampirism and the crimes of Elizabeth Bathory, storytellers have continued to perpetuate this narrative. I've listened to countless podcasters and YouTubers peddle the same fictional origin story of how Elizabeth backhanded one of her servants, and then when the blood from the girl's mouth transferred onto her hand, she realised, oh, that's silky smooth. I might want to try that in a bigger scale. Next thing you know, she's swimming in a tub of O negative, and thus the first Lady Dracula was born. But sadly, it's just a bunch of BS. There were no demonic fanged beasts within Castle Castise. Instead, it was just a lonely middle-aged female who had a thirst for violence. And listen, as a former twihard, I would love nothing more than if vampires were real. I mean, come on, I left my bedroom window open for the majority of 2008 for a reason. But as we've learned here today whilst discussing the case of Elizabeth Bathory, sometimes you shouldn't believe everything that you hear on the internet. I hope you found this week's episode informative. If you did, please smash those like and subscribe buttons. It really helps this wee channel of mine. If you're a fan of all things supernatural, UFO, conspiracy theory and all that good stuff in between, then don't forget to check out our fact or fiction horror podcast, Here She Lies, over on Spotify every Wednesday. I'll pop a link in the description box below. I hope you guys are enjoying this little history mystery series. We will have one more episode next week and then we'll move on to a new topic. Thank you for supporting the channel as always. With that being said, I love you all so much, so please lock your doors, don't talk to strangers, and also maybe don't get changed with the curtains open. I'm just saying. See ya! Big kisses. Mwah!